This is Books for Breakfast, a podcast where we talk about books and writing. I'm Enda Wiley.
And I'm Peter Sirr.
And you're all very welcome to this morning's show.
Good morning, everyone. And I'm really looking forward this morning to talking to Andrew Fitzsimons, whose new translations of the Japanese poet Basho have just been published by the University of California Press. So I'm looking forward to that, and I'll get to that in a minute. But first of all, you might have noticed that it's been a while since our last podcast. We'd planned to be back a little bit earlier than that, but kind of events intervened, didn't they, Enda? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
They did indeed. Yeah, well, events, I think as we all know, life can intervene and things can happen that you don't expect. And on the 8th of January, I think that was the date, I just happened to be walking home towards our house and I tripped and fell. An ambulance was called and I did severe damage to my shoulder and wrist. So I am post-operation now. I'm on to my 8th week of recovery and I'm beginning to move slowly around. And I think it's great, Peter, that you've encouraged us to get to the breakfast table and start our podcast.
But you actually, because you did severe damage. You actually broke and dislocated your shoulder, and you broke your wrist as well. So it's kind of pretty serious stuff, really.
Yeah, I hope I'm getting lots of sympathy now from the listeners. I also had the added agony of being sent home from A&E, and I spent a week in severe pain really before I went back and was operated on. So it's been fun and games, hasn't it, Peter?
It sure has. And let me ask you this. What does a writer do? What's a writer with a broken shoulder and a broken wrist? How do you manage?
Well, the lucky thing is I'm somebody, when I'm teaching writing, I'm always saying have a notebook and a pen nearby, and I never do. I'm always writing on the backs of envelopes or, leaving notes on my phone. But luckily, when I went into the hospital, I did have a little blue notebook with me, so I scribbled lots of things down. Actually, it's fun going back and looking at them. Many of the notes were scribbled in the darkness of the night when I couldn't sleep in the hospital. And just, I suppose, that the world seems more vivid when you can't actually enter it. So for the last few weeks, I've been, basically in my bedroom looking out the window at the changing seasons and people going by, and I think that in that kind of that strange space, I think things do come to you, and I think it is a great idea. And not that I think it's a great idea to fall and break your shoulder, but I think it's a great idea to take time out from normal life without having fallen and to just take time to think. And I think that's where writing comes from, when you have space and time to imagine and to be free like that. And hopefully not in pain, Peter, but...
And what about reading? Have you found any solace in reading, for instance? What have you been reading?
Well, I suppose it's hard at the beginning to read, but then suddenly things start coming to you. For instance, one of my favourite writers in the 80s was Hanif Qureshi. And I'm sure many of you heard that in December just gone, he had a horrific fall in Rome. And I suppose for somebody like me who had just fallen, I completely connected with this. He wrote My Beautiful Laundrette. He wrote The Bud of Suburbia. You and me love a film called Le Weekend, where Lindsay Duncan and Jim Broadbent are fantastic actors. They're aging couples. They return to Paris to rekindle their romance. That's a Hanif Qureshi play as well, or a movie as well, which I loved. But anyway, he fell, and so he's been sending dispatches from his hospital in Rome, and I really connected with that. He said he just fell in Rome and he woke up minutes later in a pool of blood. His neck was grotesquely twisted. He's not sure if he'll ever be able to walk again. But actually, some of his dispatches are really funny. So I'll just read one to you, Peter, a little bit. He says, being a tetraplegic isn't all bad. As I write this, I'm having a pedicure while eating caviar with a plastic spoon. My girlfriend is tickling me under the chin. I've just proposed to her. Barkis is willing. While she pretends to contemplate the question, to my surprise, and that of most of my friends who consider me to be less than a good catch, in fact, a bad catch, and had advised me against proposing while I'm in this condition, she eventually says, yes, of course, and laughs. And it goes on. And he creates a whole world of where he is in the hospital and the people he knows and the pain he's going through. But he can be very honest and open. So I would recommend that for people, Hanif Qureshi's dispatches, and you can sign up for them and they come. For instance, this one, he's very funny at the end. He says, I'm feeling highly sartorial today. I'm wearing my new white Snoopy socks, my black Uniqlo sports pants. On top, I have a long sleeve Picasso t-shirt, and over that, an off-white Gap hoodie. So he remains funny and cheerful and witty and I saw recently he was asking, did anyone remember or had they recommendations for memoirs about people who've been injured or hurt? And people were coming up with people like Joan Didion or The Butterfly and The Bell and books like that. But it's just, I feel connected, I suppose, with people who have been injured in some way, and I've been kind of diving into books like that. Also, I think poetry, when I'm encountering poetry, you're asking me, was I reading? I seem drawn at the moment to poems about bodily parts. So I was in conversation with James Harper, the poet, who's the new poetry fellow down in Trinity. So congratulations to James. But we were talking about this poem, Hands, by Moya Cannon, and it's a beautiful poem. She's flying home to Ireland and she's flying over the eastern coast of Brazil and she's thinking about hands. And I suppose this poem connected with me because I was thinking of my own injury, my own operation and the surgeon. And she just said, and I think of other hands which can hold lives, the hands of the surgeon, whom I will meet again when I return home, the hands of the black-haired nurse who unwound the birth cord from my neck, the soft hands of my mother, the hands of those others who have loved me, until it seems almost as though this is what a human life is, to be passed from hand to hand, to be borne up improbably over an ocean. And that's from her collection Hands. It was published in 2011 by Carcanet Press. And for somebody like me who cannot use my hand at the moment because my wrist is broken, I think that's a really beautiful poem to read and it gives me hope.
Thanks for reading that poem. And at least one good thing, at least, is that your voice is still working. So I'm looking forward to maybe doing more podcasts if we can manage.
Yeah, that's true. My voice is definitely working, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing Andy Fitzsimons, or Andrew Fitzsimons, as he's formerly known, talking about Basho.
And here he is.
Were my voice better, I'd recite the poem of The Blossoms Falling. I found I came to like him a lot. The more I got to know him, the more I liked him. I like the way he sounds, of course, as a poet, but I also liked him as a human being. The compassion he shows for the less fortunate, the loyalty to his friends, at some risk to himself. Basho was political in a way that we don't appreciate. That he when he writes about the lost voices of history in some of those travel journals, we tend to glide over them and not see them as making a point about the contemporary political situation in Japan, the Tokugawa regime he lived under. He often makes strategics. One of the things I say in the introduction, that there are deliberately enunciated silences in Basho. Often reference to historical event is couched in a silence. Poetry is not equipped. Poetry can't deal with this, he says, And he says, I put down my writing brush. This happens too often for it to be coincidence. It's often in the context of the Tokugawa regime itself. "119. Secretly in the night, in the moonlight, a weevil bores into a chestnut. 201. At the beginning of the 9th month, I went back home. The grass by my mother's room had withered in the frost, and everything had changed. The locks at the sides of my brothers and sisters' heads were white, and there were wrinkles around their eyes. We are still alive, was all we could say. My older brother opened the relic pouch and said, 'Pay your respects to mother's white hair. Like Urashima Taro with his jeweled box, your brow has aged.' For a little while, we wept. If held in my hands, it would melt from the hot touch of teardrops, the frost of autumn. 278. Cold night. A water jar cracks in the ice of the nighttime. In bed, awoken. 519. A cooling freshness I have made my dwelling place. Now all is Kushti. 262. An old patch of land. Nazuna a gathering. A clatter of men.
Matsuo Basho, born 1644, died 1694, is, many would say, the greatest figure in the history of Japanese literature, an acknowledged master of the haiku. Basho, the complete haiku of Matsuo Basho, translated, annotated, and with an introduction by Andrew Fitzsimons, offers in English a full picture of Basho's haiku, amounting to more than 900 in all. This translation is remarkable too in that it's the first to stick strictly to the form of the originals. All of the poems maintain the exact syllable count of the originals, and that's something we might come back to. Also remarkable is the way that we get to appreciate that in addition to being a poet of the natural world and, if you like, a particular Japanese sensibility, Basho is also a poet of queer love and eroticism. He's a poet of the city as well as of mountain streams. And just to give a sense of how this landmark book has been received, I'll just give you a sense. It's published by the University of California Press. A uniquely wonderful anthology. Before the light emitted by each phrase of each poem in Japanese disappears, Andrew Fitzsimons carries it across into English. An extraordinary achievement. A breath of fresh air in the middle of a chaotic world. Fitzsimons has done a beautiful job showing the uniqueness, drama and playfulness of Basho's originals. This complete set of Basho's haiku makes the poet's work in the context of his life understandable as it has never been before in English. This book marks a moment of huge significance in world poetry. And that was Bernard O'Donoghue, poet himself and professor in the University of Oxford. Joining us from Tokyo this morning is Andrew Fitzsimons, Professor of English Language and Cultures at Gakushūin University, Tokyo, and author of The Sea of Disappointment, Thomas Kinsel's Pursuit of the Real, as well as 3 books of poetry and indeed translations of 20th century Italian poetry. So welcome, Andy, and congratulations on your new translations of Basho. I mean, this is a long time labour of love. I mean, how long, just kind of to kick off with, how long have you been working on this?
Thank you, Peter. Thank you for that lovely introduction and good morning. I think I began in earnest in 2017. So, 5-6 years, I suppose, in total. But of course, I've been translating bits and pieces over the years, but with full commitment since July 2017.
And I'll come back to the kind of nature of the translations and that, and how yours are maybe different from other people's. But let me begin with just a really basic question. I mean, who exactly was the man that we know as Basho?
He was born in a place called Iga, Ueno. The town is called Ueno, and the province is called Iga. And he was born into some of the introductions you see in some of the books you see refer to him as this kind of lower ranking samurai, but he wasn't really from a samurai family at all. He's from a family which had perhaps once been a samurai family, but who had lost their status in the Warring States period, of his great grandfather's generation. So that Warring States period is familiar maybe from some of the Kurosawa films you've maybe seen, like Ran and Kagemusha, etc. So he was what's called a musokonin, or the pronunciation should be musokonin, which is a farmer, basically a small farmer. So his father was a small farmer. He did have some of the trappings of a samurai, which like a sword and a family name. So but that was about the only thing left of that. So he's a countryman from a province that was semi-isolated, surrounded by mountains, only 30 kilometers really from Kyoto, but in to all intents and purposes, a world away. And Iga had its own particular identity. And that carries through into his life when he moves to Edo, what is now known as Tokyo. He kept Iga connections. He would come back to Iga a lot, particularly in his last 10 years. He uses Iga dialect in some of his poems. So the Iga identity was very strongly part of what he felt himself to be, I think.
And just again, as was part of that context again, I mean, what kind of place was the Japan of his lifetime?
Well, it's important to remember that it was a military government, It's the Tokugawa Bakufu, it's called in Japanese, the military government, the shogunate. And the Warring States period ended in the early 17th century, around 1603. And between 1603 and 1867, we have what's called the Tokugawa shogunate, and it's also known as the Edo period. So Basho lived in the early part of the Edo period. And in the reign of I think he's the third or fourth shogun, I think Tsunayoshi was the Tokugawa shogun during his lifetime. It's around the same time, I suppose, as Andrew Marvell, Milton, around that time, 1640, 1690. That's the period we're talking about. It was a military government, so travel was difficult. You had to pass border guards, etc. He writes about that in one of his poems, in quite a few of the poems, actually. It could be a dangerous place. It could be a politically dangerous place to write things against the government, for example. So that's part of what I was trying to get across in the translations, was that Basho is also a political writer, but we need to keep our ears open for it, because he often does it, because of the nature of the regime he lived under. He does it at an angle to the regime, so to speak. 522. Hear the quietness entering into the rocks. Cicada, refrain. 41. As the clouds drift apart, for now, friend, we separate. Wild geese living, leave. 282. A man named Sora has made temporary residence near my hut, and we visit each other often. When I cook, he helps feed the fire. At night, when I make tea, he breaks ice for water. By nature, a man who likes quiet and solitude, he has become a dear friend. One evening, after a snowfall, he dropped by. Friend of mine, make the fire. I will show you something great. A snowball this big. 40. A pair of deer rubbing hair up against hair, each other's hair, so hard to please. 152. Ume and willow. A lightsome young man, maybe a woman.
He grows up, he starts writing, but what kind of poetry, for instance, was being written when Basho came into his own as a poet? What was the surrounding sort of literary landscape like?
Basho must have shown some sort of talent at this, because he was taken under the wing of the local clan, in particular, one of the members of that clan whose name was Sengin, and he took Basho under his wing. Basho became a retainer of that clan. And we think that the supposition is that Basho must have had some kind of talent in this form of poetry.
And yet, I think it's fair to say that he was interested in subverting that sort of inherited poetic form. I mean, you say, for instance, that his subjects were unorthodox within the haikai world, and I was wondering, like, what made them unorthodox?
Well, one of the things to remember, of course, he was different within the genre he worked, but the genre itself was a form of parody. It was a way of undermining pretension. For example, the haikai form was adopting and aping the forms of the nobility and the classical forms of classical verse, but by twisting, and certainly by taking a classical form and inserting a word that would be inappropriate to that context. So it was a kind of already an irreverent form. Now, Basho took part in that, etc. And he demonstrated his difference, I suppose, and one of his great achievements is by taking a form that was considered light and making it serious and using it for serious ends. So I suppose one of the ways we could think about it is the way, I suppose, rock music or pop music became a form for serious thoughts and serious artists in the 60s, I suppose that would be an equivalent to what Basho did.
You quote one of his most celebrated poems, On a Leafless Bough, the perching and pausing of a crow, the end of autumn. And you say about this that the poem can be read as an emblem of Basho's resolve to place poetry at the spiritual centre of his existence. And I wonder, could you say a bit about that?
As I said, there was a huge increase in literacy in Japan at this time, which led to a huge increase in the demand for what were called haikaishi, professional poets. So Basho became one of these. He moved, after the death of his mentor, Sengin, or his protector, I should say, in Iga, he moved to Edo to make a name for himself as a poet. And he fulfilled all the professional duties of the haikaishi. He was a marker of poems. He was a tenja. And he wasn't cut out for it. It was drudgery for him, And he says once, better be a beggar than a tenja. And so when I said that about the putting poetry at the spiritual center, the poetry became much more serious and less of a game, less of a career. And he started following, rather than the some of the models he had been following, the Chinese models, for example, he started following figures like Saigyo and Sogi, are much more inclined towards the serious than his previous poems and his previous models.
The point at which he actually becomes Basho, because he wasn't born Basho, and he moves to Fukugawa, and it becomes important for him, and then and the name, he kind of takes on the name at that point, isn't that right?
Yeah, he had a number of names. Of course, his birth name was Matsuo Kinsaku, and he had a number of names after that. Sobo was one of them, and then in Edo he became Tosei, which means green peach, and he became Basho. Basho is it's the Musa Basho. It's a kind of banana tree, a plantain. He became Basho because he received a gift from one of his followers, Rika, and the basho was planted outside his hut in Fukugawa in Tokyo. And over time, people just started referring to the place as the basho and the basho hut, and then as the resident of the hut as Basho himself. And he had given himself a different name, but people just started to know him as this, and he kind of liked it, and that's what he became, Basho.
And at a certain point, his hut burns, and you say interestingly that he said that was the beginning of my understanding of the mutability of human life. He says, and homelessness becomes important, doesn't it? I mean, that sense, you describe his sense of homelessness and his feeling for displaced life, and how this kind of drove his urge to wander, and the journeys that took up so much of his life in the last kind of 10 years of his life. To become what he described himself as a wayfaring man. And I wonder, is that how you describe him too?
That is certainly, in the last 10 years of his life, that is certainly what he became. It wasn't always the case, but he always had a feeling for displaced life. He always had a feeling for the marginal, for the poor. In one of the first poems that he wrote, he talks about an abandoned child, a sutego, an abandoned child. So there was always a sense that he was looking at the disregarded, the unregarded, even in such things as the climate, the weather that he describes in his poems. Shigure, the winter rain, the early winter rain, is very much prominent in his work. So he has a feeling for the undernoticed or the unnoticed. And there's a huge degree of compassion, even early on.
One of the things that's interesting that you point to is, like, I mean, you talk about his travels, but you also point out he's not a solitary traveller, in spite of the image that we might have of him. And you have a nice calculation that he never travelled more than 24K alone. And, there's also, you talk about poetry being, in a way, a communal activity. I mean, the exact opposite of our experience in some ways, a Western kind of experience. Unless we think of the exceptional case of Wordsworth and Coleridge and so on, working, all those, the lake poets kind of working together.
Sure.
But that kind of communality seems to be important.
Yeah, and it's also important to remember that the poems in this we call them haiku now. They weren't called haiku by Basho. That is a term that only became current in the early 20th century through the work of a man called Masaoka Shiki. Basho would have called them hokku, and hokku means the initiating poem in a verse sequence. And he would have written these because he was invited to various occasions where he was the master and he was the leader of the Renga sequence, and would be guiding them through the afternoon or evening or whatever of this linked verse occasion, So the hokku, because it was an occasion, because it was in a place. That's why we have one of these peculiar things that people wonder about, the season word in a haiku. It's because he was invited to a particular house on a particular day at a particular time, and one of the things he had to do was to mark that time, to mark that occasion. And the season word was one of the things you included. Another thing you included was praise of the host, for example. So there are many poems in which they're ceremonial. They're praising the host. They're referring to some quality of the area as well. So there's that aspect of the poems to remember.
I suppose if people had to say, if you said to people, name one poem by Basho, they'd probably go for the one about an olden pond now, a song frog springs off into the sound of water. You say the single best known poem in, not just of Basho, but the single best known poem in Japanese literature, the significance of which was recognized almost as soon as it was written, you say. And I was just wondering, we're all very familiar with the poem in some ways, but in a way that makes us perhaps take it for granted. But could you explain the significance of it? And actually, we might hear you read it first.
Furuike ya kawazu tobikomu, mizu no oto. An olden pond now, a song frog springs off into the sound of water. Important to remember, as well as the idea of this group activity, is there's a fictional element in it. And one of the things I wanted to get across in presenting the full picture of Basho is that one of the things that he wasn't was a Zen monk. He wasn't a Zen monk. So often the readings of this poem place it within the Zen context, that this was an actual moment, that there was an actual frog jumping into an actual frog, and Basho transcribed this moment as a kind of a spiritual event. But in fact, there was no pond, there was no frog. He had the second two lines first. We have kawazu tobikomu mizu no oto. Okay, so he had those lines, which is the frog jumping into the sound of water. Okay, and he needed a first, what's called a capping line. And at a session, it was suggested to him by a man called Kikaku that he put in Yamabuki ya, which is Keria roses. Now, there was an association within Japanese literature of Yamabuki, Keria roses, and kawazu, these frogs, because this particular frog is not our gribbet frog. It's not the frog that makes that kind of sound. It's a very musical frog that trills like an insect sound. And it's associated within the Japanese literary tradition with the composition of poetry itself. And this association goes back to the 12th century to a man called Kino Tsurayuki and his preface called the Kana preface to the Kokin Wakashu. So there's a long association between this kawazu, this frog, and poetry itself.
So it's kind of a meta frog and a meta pond kind of.
Yes, and what Basho is trying to do is renew the tradition, to renew poetry itself. And one of the things he does is say, no, I'm not going to put Yamabuki, I'm going to put Furuike ya, an old pond. And that's why in my translation, I tried to get across that playing with tradition, that breaking of convention, that renewal of tradition he's trying to achieve in the poem. So I translated it as an olden pond now. So Furuike ya can be there or now,
It also, because it gave rise to a whole contest of frog poems. There was like the frog contest kind of came out of this as well,
yeah,
isn't it?
Yeah, that's yeah. Well, another thing we were talking about the idea of poetry as communal, but another thing was it was competitive. The awase was a poetry competition, and one of the parts of the poet's life that Basho didn't like was judging competitions. So that was part of his function as a haikaishi as well. And yes, there was the frog contest shortly after the poem was written, and there was a session. But of course, we have to remember that this was kind of humorous too. It wasn't po-faced, These are enjoyable occasions. And another aspect of Basho that I wanted to get across is the humor. How witty the poems are, how playful they are, how full of puns they are, particularly the earlier work.
That comes across. I think that very much comes across, and it brings me on to actually what I wanted to talk about next, which was the translation, your translation. I mean, I was wondering, if you could say something about your own approach to it. I mean, obviously, because like Basho has been translated many times, but you say yours is the first translation to adhere strictly to form. So kind of maybe we could talk about that aspect first. Can you explain sort of what that adherence to form, or the strict adherence to form, entails?
The way we describe the haiku is 575 syllables, but of course in Japanese they're not quite syllables. They're called technically speaking, the more. And in Japanese, each unit is called an on, which just means sound. So it's broken down into sound. So there's no real equivalent between an on and a syllable, but I accepted the English syllable as a near equivalent. And I tried to follow 575. But the other thing to remember is that Basho didn't always follow 575. Sometimes there are 10 syllables or 10 on to a line. And the other thing to remember that there isn't 3 lines, it's 1 line in Japanese. So I accepted the 3-line tradition in English for good and ill, because you can achieve a lot with line.
Because I have seen translations of haiku that adhere to the 1 line. In fact, have a single line in English.
Hiroaki Sato does that. He has a single line. So I accepted the 3-line form, and wanted to get across the way that Basho plays across the single line in Japanese, where you can have a great deal of ambiguity within that 1 line, where what to place a modifier with, for example, So I tried to get across some of that, and I also tried to get across the kireiji, the cutting word. That's another famous thing about haiku. It's often considered, it's about juxtaposition, and this, I think Ezra Pound has a lot to answer for when it comes to this. The idea that a haiku is a juxtaposition of 2 elements. That's not always the case either. It can be the case, and later on it does become perhaps more fully the case, but it's not always the case.
As you were talking about that cutting word, and that's often represented by dashes in other translations, and you were saying you were trying to find a way to represent the tension in the original, if I've understood that right, to enable the sense that constraint had been overcome. You're paraphrasing Seamus Heaney there.
I think that's all. That's for my own sense of what a poem does. I needed some sense of achievement, my own, in English. When people were asking me, why did I do it and all that, I wanted to improve my English. That having this formal constraint, you have to dig deeper. Dig deeper into the word hoard. My intuition was really that Basho could not be so very different from any great poet in any language. So that he wasn't a philosopher, that he wasn't offering propositions about the world which just happened to be in poem form. And after coming to know the work, I wanted to show that first and foremost he was a poet, and concerned with what all poets are concerned with, which was what, like, Geoffrey Hill calls writing into the language. When I was trying to get to grips with the poems, I tried to imagine what it was like before the poems happened, what might have motivated them in terms of the language in which they were written, by which I mean the kinds of things that they were doing with the language. Why, for instance, Basho chose one word rather than another. His choice of a dialect word in one poem, or a word for the classical a word from the classical lexicon in another. What he was doing with sound and rhythm, and I was trying, at least in my own head, to get back to the impulse that motivated each poem. I wanted my version to have kind of a similar ontological necessity, for want of a better phrase. I wanted to re-experience the restrictions first encountered by Basho himself, and attend to what he kind of learned from them. 85. Winter rain. The scudding of clouds. A dog running and pissing. A passing shower.
I love that pissing dog.
Everyone does. 518. From Narugo Onsen, we wanted to enter the province of Dewa through Shitomai barrier. Few travelers come along this road, so the border guards were suspicious and interrogated us at length before they finally allowed us to pass. As the sun set, we reached the summit of a large mountain and saw a border guard's house, where we asked for a night's lodging. Heavy rain and wind for the next 3 days confined us to this dismal place. The fleas and the lice, and a horse having a pee at my pillow side. 257. At the end of the 4th month, I arrived back at my hut and recuperated from my long journey. From my summer robes, I still haven't quite done with picking out the hoppers. 135. The pleasures of spring at Ueno. Tipsy from the blossoms, the howry-wearing woman sporting a curved sword. 138. Cherry blossoms in full bloom, a hippity-hoppity monk, a wife all flirty.
You say you're not a scholar of classical Japanese, but you are a poet and a scholar of poetry, and you've written a book on Thomas Kinsella. You write about contemporary poetry from these islands, and you've translated the likes of Dante, Montale, and Ungaretti. I mean, that experience, both as a writer about poetry, translator, and poet, must have helped a bit in doing these translations.
That really helped in terms of increasing vocabulary when you're trying to fill in those lines. You really have to dig into the word horde with him. So I felt in some ways through that experience equipped to take on the job, to take on the challenge of Basho. The thing with Basho, of course, you're working within on a much smaller canvas. So every single item counts, and uh, um, every single syllable counts. And I remember having a conversation recently with a friend of mine, Tim Harris, who said that he also translates Japanese. And one of his findings was that he hates the English definite article and indefinite article. And I understand how he feels, Another thing is, things like there is, there are become so dead in the context of a haiku, So I found it, however, a wonderful experience in trying to find solutions to those problems, and elated when I did actually find a solution that worked.
I mean, the first thing to strike the reader, it struck me anyway, apart from the translations, are the extensive notes that come after. I mean, this is really a scholarly work, and so it's not just the haiku. I mean, it's you get all of these extensive notes, and they really are extraordinary. Sometimes the notes are substantially longer than the poems, and we also get Basho's own head notes, which are often fascinating and throw great light on the poems. And you read some of those for us as well. Could you say anything about that? Those two things, that kind of scholarly sort of elucidation that you have, and also his own kind of head notes and how they fit into the poems.
I think some of the poems are just not available to us without context, some sense of what was going on around them. So I started off by just giving a few notes to a few poems, and then I said, no, I have to go the full hog with this one. And I need more. And it was also for myself to help me understand the poems. There's one poem, the Box for a Koto poem that I read, which I really couldn't understand. And I could only understand it when I found out that the setting of it was in Omondori, which was the entrance to the red light district, the Yoshiwara district in Edo. So that I could see that the poem is actually a 17-syllable novel about the fate of this woman, and so the notes certainly were for the public and in the book and all that, but they were also for me to understand the poems, to help me understand the poems. Basho's head notes are wonderful. They're his. They were included in the early editions of his work that were published. They often feature also in the travelogues that were published. The most famous, of course, is known as The Narrow Road to the Deep North, or Oku no Hosamichi in Japanese. So they're in there too. He wrote small prose pieces called haibun. So the prose elements are part of the Basho tradition. So I wasn't adding them in. So some of them are newly translated. Some of them have never been translated before, but I'm not adding them in.
Can you talk to us about? Two things. I mean, queer Basho, right? Because I mentioned in the introduction, Basho's poems of erotic male love, and it's not necessarily a thing that readers are familiar with. I mean, can you say something about that side of his work? In a way, I suppose maybe it's a kind of hidden side of him. I mean, how is homosexuality viewed in 17th century Japan?
It's a complicated subject, of course, but he writes, and I quoted in the introduction, that at one point in my life I was attracted to the ways of, it's called nanshoku, male love. And in some of the earlier poems, we see this. But throughout the poems, it's still there. Near the very end, Now, it's not him taking part, of course. He's noting things, and it's a kind of social portrait. He writes of the moon's clarity escorting a catamite afraid of foxes. So throughout, there's a noting of male and male love, but it wasn't condemned in 17th century Japan. It wasn't an identity in the way that we think of it now. It was something somebody did. It wasn't what somebody was, and there's no sense of himself feeling conflicted over this.
That's interesting. And another aspect is there's one poem, I think it's poem number 366, but it's dedicated to Sonoma, who is regarded as Basho's most accomplished female disciple. And I suppose we often think of the haiku poetry of this period as primarily a male tradition. But I'm interested in what role did women play? Were there many women poets?
No, there weren't. There's Ichiyu's wife, yeah. Beyond the curtain, beyond the deep inner room, a north wing, Ume. Yeah. The most famous female poet of the Japanese tradition is Ono no Komachi. She's one of the seven immortals of the Japanese tradition. But really, it's not till the 20th century that we have a larger female tradition in Japanese poetry. So Yosuno Akiko, for example, up until more recent times, Ibaragi Noriko, for example. At the time, I really wouldn't have enough knowledge to know if there are figures that have been ignored by the tradition. It seems to have meant to be an almost entirely male world.
We know about Basho, or we think we know about him. I mean, he's one of the most translated poets in the world, probably. But I get a sense from your work that the Basho that we know is only kind of part of the story. I mean, you say, for instance, that, he's associated with brevity, restraint, zen austerity, not with linguistic brio or even fine excess. Yet the range and subtlety of Basho's language is extraordinary, you say. Coming out of the world of haikai poetry and its conventions, he mingles high and low diction, elevated literary idioms with a keen ear for the demotic and so on. But you're really saying that there's an awful lot more to him, I suppose, and to his work than we generally think. I mean, if you had to summarize, what is it that why should we read Basho?
Basho has the qualities of any great poet. There's a huge range to the writing. I think we have a very limited view of what he writes about. He doesn't just write about the moon and flowers. He writes about people. The poetry is peopled. He describes a range of emotions that we don't usually associate with him, the full range of human emotions. So one of the most moving poems to me is one he wrote as an older man, where he says, in the 7th year of Genroku, while I was staying at Otsu, I received a letter from my older brother asking me to come home for the Bon festival. The whole house of us, with walking sticks and white hair, visiting the grave. That reminds me of, Thomas Kinslett in some ways. Not merely because I translated it, but that's what it says in the Japanese too. So there's a range of human emotion in it. There's a range of human experience in it that we haven't really had a picture of in the kind of more limited numbers of poems that we've been allowed to see over the years. I think with the full picture before us, he becomes a very, very different writer, a more fully human writer, a more fully complex character. The poetry becomes much more interesting, I think, much more varied. And he becomes, I suppose, in some ways, much more contemporary. We can recognize him as being like ourselves.
That was Andrew Fitzsimons talking about Basho, the complete haiku of Matsuo Basho, translated, annotated, and with an introduction by Andrew Fitzsimons. And it is published by the University of California Press. And all details of the book will be available, as usual, on the website at booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. All right, and now we come to the part of the programme dreaded and feared by some guests and eagerly anticipated by others, and that is the Toaster Challenge. And the idea is that we ask our guests to talk to us for as long as it takes to make a nicely charred slice of toast about a book that has resonated with them in some way. Off you go, Andy. We count you in and we say 1, 2, 3. The toast is now in the toaster.
I want to talk about Thomas Bernhard's 3 Days. Thomas Bernhard was an Austrian writer born in 1931 and he died in 1989. He's a writer I discovered in 1991 in Books Upstairs when it was on College Green. I picked up his novel Correction, which had a superb blurb by George Steiner on it. I bought it, finished it that night, and have read anything I can find by him since then, in translation, of course. Frost, The Limeworks, Concrete, Wittgenstein's Nephew, Woodcutters, which is also translated as Cutting Timber. The novels are usually first-person narratives spoken by someone perennially at the end of their tether, railing against the world in its ludicrous ways, and his own ludicrous ways as well. The narrator is usually a he. If you've read Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground, you'll recognize him immediately. Bernhard was a novelist, but also a prolific playwright. Famously, in his will, he forbade all productions of his work in Austria. Such was his antipathy to the cultural institutions of that state. 3 Days is the most recent book of his that I have read, as it was only translated in 2018 by Laura Lindgren in a beautiful edition by Blast Books in New York. If you know his work, this book is like getting a peek behind the curtain at the mechanisms driving a stage performance. We see where the books come from, and you can see that it was also the generative text for his autobiographical work, Gathering Evidence, one of his best books, one of the most extraordinary I've ever read, actually. Probably where I would recommend anyone to start. It features one of the most extraordinary first days at school in all of literature. And we get a glimpse of that first day in early form in this book, 3 Days. 3 Days is actually the text of a film made in 1970 by Ferry Raddax. And I've just discovered that the film is actually available on YouTube now and with English subtitles. It features Bernhard on a bench under a tree in a garden in Hamburg, talking about his memories, his inclinations, his attitudes, and his work, all of which seem mysterious and unexplainable to him. He says he writes out of resistances, that he loathes storytellers, and at any sign of a story in his work, he sets about destroying it. He's a story destroyer rather than a storyteller, he says. Writing comes to him with difficulty, which is precisely why, he says, he chooses to do it. He trained as a musician, but stopped, for it all came too easily to him, he says. He also trained as an actor, and the book begins with an anecdote about learning lines for a play but he found that he could never get past the first line, which emerged in the Limeworks in the story of Conrad, the protagonist who can't get past the first line of a study he's been working on for 20 years. The contradiction in Bernhard, in the man and his work, is the pleasure, excruciating pleasure to be found in such difficulty, and even in the contemplation of the at times horrifying bizarreness of reality. He's a wonderful writer, gloomy, as he says himself, but hilarious within that gloom. He's not for everyone, maybe, but I wish more people knew his work. Is the toast done?
The toast that's perfect. Yeah, that's the perfect slice of toast, nicely cooked, and fascinating. That was fascinating, and Bernhard is like, as you're saying, it's almost like the anti-writer's anti-writer kind of, and that notion of that loathing of Austria is so striking, isn't it? And that comes through in all of the work. Loathing of writing and loathing of Austria, the two kind of characteristics. Thank you very much for that. That was a fascinating insight into Thomas Bernhard, and of course, thanks again to Andy for that fascinating account of Basho.
I think we've reached the end of our Books for Breakfast podcast this morning. I'm definitely rushing off to have more coffee. And I'm Enda Wiley and I have Peter Sirr here with me. And Peter, would you like to tell everyone about the details of the podcast if they'd like to listen again?
Well, you can subscribe at all the usual sources, Google and Apple and so on. And if you want to check out the notes that go along with this podcast, you can go to booksforbreakfast.buzzsprout.com. And yeah, so
we'll be back again. We'll have the toast on, we'll have the kettle boiling, we will have more books to discuss, and we're looking forward to having you here. So goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.